All right, folks, welcome back. So in our last lecture, we talked a lot about the concept of race, right? And how this idea that race in humans is founded in biological differences cannot really be sustained. I think at this point we know quite well, right? The evidence that I showed to you, all the information that we've been discussing, all of our understanding of how evolution in itself happens, and also this idea of how culture interacts with our biology to shape ourselves, to shape our species. All of this very clearly point out to the fact that we cannot sustain an idea of fitting our species in these very discrete boxes that we call races. However, I want to use the second question then to the second lecture to bring this discussion to see it from the other side. If we have enough evidence, right? If it's quite obvious that humans do not fall within discrete races, how come this idea become established, right? How come do we have such a misconception? How come it is so common for us to really think about this idea that, like, to accept the idea that humans fall neatly inside these boxes that we label as races? So in this lecture, I want to talk then about like our own way of how we perceive the world, right, and how we characterize the world, and the implications this has for the discussion of race. So we're gonna, in a way, draw a line connecting a lot of the discussions we had before to see what are the implications of the discussion. Like what I really want to provoke you in this lecture is really for us to stop for a while and think about how our own biases, how our own construction, how our own view of the world really shapes, really defines our understanding of human variation, and why it is so important for us to have this kind of discussions in classes like this in the context of anthropology, sociology, and several other disciplines that allow us to have a different perspective, that allow us to have a perspective that really encompasses the totality of human variation itself, right? So let's go back then to our initial discussions about like the acquisition of knowledge, right? And how the role that science has into this, right? Like, so science ultimately is, as we discussed, associated with the acquisition of knowledge through the scientific method. However, different from what we usually discuss, or different of how this is usually presented, science is not unbiased, right? Science is actually guided and affected by a lot of our perceptions of what we believe our reality is. So the way we explain the world is highly influenced by what we think the world should look like, right? And therefore it has also shaped a lot of scientific knowledge in itself, and it has propagated a lot of these misconceptions. The classification of humans into races being a good example of this. So ultimately, if science is about acquiring knowledge, right? Like the question that comes, the question that derives from this is like knowledge, okay, but what for, right? Why do we really need to talk about scientific? How do we really need to improve our knowledge so that we can actually represent the world, right? So ultimately, I think that this is a very easy answer. If we ask around, if I ask you in a quiz or a survey to ask me what's the point of acquiring knowledge, the answer, one of the answers that will appear the most often will be like to improve our lives. However, the provocation that I bring to you is that this is not always that easy, because the definition in itself of what is a better life, or the definition of itself of what is like meaningful knowledge or not, can change a lot from culture to cultural background, right? In other words, we can come up with different reasons. Even our definition of what is right and wrong is contextual. Why? Because again, we have a whole layer of culture, right? Enveloping our biology and reinterpreting what our biology is, reinterpreting our relationship to the environment, so that everything that we are and how we relate to the reality that we see is ultimately contextual. So the reason why this is not easy is because evidently we show a series of cognition biases, and this is my main challenge for you at this point, right? What I want you to do is to, after I present this and the next slide, I want you to stop. I want you to stop the video for a few minutes, and I want you to just do a quick exercise to see if you can find examples of each one of these biases that are so common in us. The reason why I'm doing this is that these biases that are common among all humans are also common among scientists, are also common among those of us who are actually in charge of trying to describe reality itself. And the reason why it's so important for us to understand this bias is that until we understand what is biasing our views, it's really hard for us to come outside of our own path, right? Outside of this narrow view of what is our definition of reality, our interpretation of the world around us, and really have an open-minded view that is actually allowing us to look for better alternative explanations that are also guiding us to get closer and closer to what the reality really is, right? This, again, has a series of implications to the discussion of race, and particularly to the impact of racial thinking in the discrimination of specific ethnic groups among humans. So let's go. We have in this slide 5 different biases. On the next slide we have another series of biases. Let's go briefly through them. I want you to find examples of each of them as we go through it, or pause the video at any time, think about them, and return. So the first bias I want to introduce you to is our social desirability bias, right? Like it's this bias that creates this tendency of us putting forward opinions that we believe will be well received by others, right? Several examples of this are easy to find. We usually choose what stories to say. We usually choose what ideas to defend, depending on our perception of how people will accept them or not. Associated to this, we have our confirmation biases, right? Which means that we favor ideas that confirm our expectations. Go to social media. We all follow social channels, right? We all follow communication. We all follow like news of those channels that speak to issues that we already validate our own expectations, validate our own views in itself, right? Then we have motivated cognition, the belief that these positive outcomes are more likely than they really are. In other words, there's a tendency that we have of being optimistic and actually focusing on the fact that we're gonna have positive outcomes for this, right? Like, so this explains, for example, our tendency of like investing so much effort in playing at the lottery, even though there's a very tiny chance of you actually winning it. You still will put money into it because your perception of the outcomes of a positive role in this case is much distorted, is much biased by itself. We have a very common bias, which is what we should call sunk cost fallacy, right? Which means that once we start investing on something, we will keep doing what we've been doing even long after it stopped being promising, right? Like, so once you start investing on something, you actually will follow that path through, even once you already know deep inside that this is not the right path to go. We have in-group biases, where we believe that members of our group are more intelligent than others, right? In other words, we believe that those around us and those people that we know, those groups, those ethnic groups, those cultures, those who speak the same language, or ultimately those of our race, are actually more intelligent than others. This is a very common bias and affects not only racial discrimination, affects gender discrimination, affects sexual discrimination, affects a series of other discriminations all around of the history of our society. All right, so this is it. Stop the slide for a minute or so, think through it, come up with examples of this. I think they should be easy to come, but I want you to put some effort thinking to it. Once you're ready, just move on, and we're going to go to our next slide. So cognition biases don't end with these common ones, right? There's a series of other biases that affects our daily basis, affects our ability to make decisions that are actually fully informed by the data, fully informed by the knowledge that we have around of the world, right? Apophenia is a very common pattern in humans, right? We see noise, we see patterns in noise or chaos, right? For example, we see faces in clouds, we see associations in things that are actually not clearly associated in itself, right? We create distinct associations because once you did well in a test, when you were wearing that red t-shirt, then you associate that success of the test with wearing the t-shirt, and you create all these kind of associations. We have the halo effect, where like opinions of famous individuals are more respected than opinions from individuals who we don't know. Again, social media has plenty of examples of this. You guys will certainly find an easy examples of this. We have a false consensus effect, where we tend to overestimate how many people actually agree with us. Every time we're speaking, every time we're sharing ideas, we always believe that there's much more people who share the same opinions with us than they actually do. We have attentional biases, right? Which is when we consider a fact to be more likely, the more often we've heard of it. This is a very a very common effect, right? And it's even like have been used in news outlets, in social medias. It has even been used like in teaching for a while, right? And you might have noticed how I've been drawing this idea of biology interacting with culture and environment over and over again, right? This is a way for me to reinforce this idea because I know there is a psychological path in the human brain that will start to put attention to things the more often they're repeated to you. And because this is the most important message I can get from this class, this is something that you guys will be literally be seeing over and over again and hopefully dreaming about for years to come. And finally, the last one, which I call here the mother of all of the biases, is the bias blind spot. Is this idea or this belief that we're actually not biased. The bias affects other people, but not us. So why am I doing all of this long interjection about cognition biases? Because cognition biases are at the root of us understanding how some ideas who are misconceptions, who are erroneous about the origins of humankind, about the origins of modern human variation, actually took hold in the first place, right? And how they still have a lot of impact in our societies, even though we have been aware of the lack of racial differences in terms of human biology for decades now. So again, let's stop this slide once more. Take 1-2 minutes, just go through these examples, do a quick exercise of finding examples that relate to you. I'm pretty sure you will be able to find. Think particularly about the bias blind spot. Think particularly about how often you have like thought about biases and actually been thought also that like biases affect other people or not. I know it happens to everyone, it happens to me all often, so that I think it's a very important exercise for us no matter what. All right, assuming you guys pause the video and did the exercise, we're gonna move forward and with the discussion of the implications that it has in the definition, in the origins of concept of race. So the concepts of race, right, the origins of this idea that humans are organized in distinct boxes, in distinct biological categories that are the equivalent of subspecies, right, is actually deriving from two of this long traditions that we discussed when we were talking about the history of evolutionary thought, right? Essentialism being one of them, and biological determinism, right? Essentialism as in the sense that there's an essence to humans, that humans all are the result of a specific form, ideal form, and that every variation that comes from this is a degradation from this essential form. And the other one, this idea of biological determinism, in the sense that like a biology will define who we're meant to be, and evolution is actually leading us to become better and better human beings, which is one of the big misconceptions that we talked about when we were talking about evolutionary theory. This informed a lot of the views of the world, like particularly the Europe-centric views of the world, right, and define the creation of these meaningful categories, right? So a lot of this discussion of race really becomes at the forefront of human social development when you see the big during the big age of exploration, right? When you see the expansion of European countries actually going to very distant lands, which actually cause a disconnection, right? Like if you go from Europe all the way to Africa, you're going to see the two extremes of human variation, at least in terms of skin color, right? As we talked, that is associated with the latitude, without having a good sense of the gradual transition that occurs in between. Then Europeans take like thousands, millions of slaves into the Americas and create a pocket of human diversity that is associated, that is the result of this extreme of human variation into the Americas, creating then this dual view of human reality, right? This idea where you have European settlers that come from one extreme of human variation, and African slaves that come from the other extreme of human variation, coexisting as if there was nothing in between, right? prior to these discussions, prior to this moment of time, there was really very little interest in the concept of race. Race was something that was used to describe different populations in the past, but was not associated with clear distinctions in ability, in qualities, in the capacity to be civilized. So, in that sense, this is the moment where we start to see different groups being described into these different races. And it's only at this point that you have the creation of like this stank box-like the classification of humans into these very distinct units of human organization. You actually see this result actually appearing already with like some of the famous naturalists, like people who were scholars who were trying to understand the organization and classification of people, right? So if you go to the work of Linnaeus that we talked before, right, that created the current definition that we use of species, a genus, family, etc., etc., etc. Linnaeus already tried to classify Homo into several different species, right? If you take a look at the zoom, I'm going to show this better in the next slide, you have several different races assigned by Linnaeus because the reports that he had about human variation were ones that actually was showing a lot of diverse forms, a lot of diverse human forms that should fit better into races than into one single species, because these reports highlighted the differences between groups, like highlighted how different everything else, highlighted it from a perspective of European supremacy, right? From a perspective of Europeans believing that they were the only human beings capable of being civilized. So Linnaeus actually created several different descriptions of humans, right? Like where he created Homo europaeus albus, Homo americanus rubensis, Homo asiaticus fuscus, Homo africanus niger, which is basically the corresponding to white Europeans, Native Americans, Asians, and African itself. And he even adds the Homo monstrosus, which is like based on the reports that they had at the time of chimpanzees, of these like feral humans that existed in Africa that were not quite human, but also not different from humans, right? So he classified a series of species that he knows only from reports into this category of Homo sapiens monstrosus, which is then later have been shown to be other species, all of the species of apes. This is highly affected by biological determinism, right? Like by this idea that the character and the aptitude that we have is completely inherited and is the result of this like essential forms of humanity already being defined early on. It does not take into account the fact of the similarities, does not take into account all of the things that we discussed last week in terms of the gradual changes that occur, or even the history of human dispersion across of the planet. This division of races then, once it is created, again, based solely on reports, right? Because Linnaeus is not traveling and seeing this. Linnaeus is collecting reports and defining that based on essentialism and biological determinism, there are distinct races. Once this concept of race is created, then you have a process of transforming these races into biological categories, right? So again, it's not that humans occupy naturally or fulfill naturally, fall naturally inside different races, but that races were constructed socially as a way to make sense of the reality that was seen from Europe in the 16th and 17th century, and later it acquired biological. Later it was imbued with biological meaning, right? Like, and this starts with several works, but like I think one of the most famous one for us to talk about is the work from Blumenbach, who actually defines the races and the terms of the races that to some extent we still use today, right? The Caucasian, the Ethiopian, the American, Mongolian, Malay, right? Like all of them static races in the sense that they are representative of things that cannot change, of things that have always been like this, because they still fall into the idea of an essential unit, an essential an essential entity that defines humanity that cannot be changed, that cannot evolve over time, right? So this is something that it was based both on skin color and skull morphology. You're going to see that already in one of these early drawings of Blumenbach. You also have even the chimpanzee appearing here as the Homo monstrosus. I want to highlight the fact how, like, you see that the artistic the depiction of the chimpanzee also show this as an evil, angry-looking animal, right? Rather than like farther away from what you see your typical description of the European civilized and pious and looking like wisely to the top, right? So again, biology is superimposed on a concept of race that originally was created from a cultural background, from an attempt of Europeans to make sense of reality based on the false premises of biological determinism and essentialism. This also is highly tied with the competing theories of the origins of humankind, right? Like, so you have Europe at this point largely defined by histories of creation of humankind that fall under this idea of one single origin, right? Like falls from the Bible, from the Catholic from the Catholic belief, from the Catholic religion, where you have one single origin. All of the individuals, all of humans descend from Adam and Eve, and then there is like a human degeneration from a white European origin, right? Because again, this is seen from the perspective of Europe. You basically see that everyone else that is not European under this premise must be the result of a degeneration of the European, of this ideal form, and therefore already starts to create this idea of hierarchies, right? Of like who is a better representation of humanity and who is the least human of all of these races. This conflicts a lot with several other religions, right? With several other histories of origin, right? So you have several religions across of the planet that actually are looking at this from a polygenic kind of point of view, right? Where like humanity was created, even if created by God or gods, was created multiple times. Each of these creations led to the creation of one single distinct race, right? So under this idea of multiple origins, humans originated in different places from different ancestors, right? Is an idea that was really popular in ancient Greece and Rome. It was not popular again until the 1970s, because when you start to find these different so-called races that are so different from each other, right? And the reason why it was not not that popular is ultimately because it did not follow the history described in the Bible, which is again the most accepted explanation from the origins of humankind during most of the last several centuries in Europe. All of this then is to talk about this idea of how different populations are making how different societies are making different explanations about the origins of human variation, right? About the origin of different human populations, and how these misconceptions that come up that appear from their own biases of understanding the world create categories that, rather than being biological realities, become biologicized by the fact that once they become cultural realities, once they become accepted as in the cultural background where they're being used. And this goes like this accepts, this expands, this biologization, the transformation of races into biological categories is something that transcends the discussion of philosophy and religion, right? It transcends the discussion of the animal kingdom in itself, and it becomes part of several scientific disciplines associated with anthropology, right? Like, so early physical anthropology studies that were concerned about this idea of describing human variation were focusing a lot on trying to identify the biological differences between human races, right? So the early onset of anthropometry, which is this area of anthropology was associated with the measurement of biological characteristics, was directly tied to the typological concepts of race, to the concept that there was different racial types in humanity, and that these types actually represent unique categories, and therefore we can divide them into races based on objective scientific measuring. So this is an interesting example of bias, right? Because now we have this idea that started as a cultural definition based on our poor perception of human variation. Right? It starts to become accepted as a culture. It starts to become defined as a biological reality, right? A biological reality of these different races. Once this becomes here, now you have scientific endeavors trying to find the measurements that actually exist. And like lo and behold, if you look at the right traits, right, you'll be able to actually find the right traits. And this is actually, to some extent, this is true even nowadays, right? Like, for example, even though we see genetic differences between African descendants and Europeans, we find this difference because we're looking at them as different populations, different races. To some extent, if you go back and look, separate the North American population into, I don't know, Buckeye fans and Michigan fans, you will find genetic markers that separate Michigan from Buckeyes. And you could make an argument that this preference for football teams is actually associated, is rooted on a biological, on biological grounds, right? This is what's happening with this early onset of anthropometry, of measuring it. This in itself creates and repercussions that go beyond science, go beyond the application of this to understand human variation, right? Like one of the most nefarious, if also interesting, right, is this idea or the whole discipline of phrenology that became so common back then, right, where you can actually measure individuals' head, measure individuals' biological appearance, and actually see what this individual was, what personality this individual was, right? So it was common enough that it became even attractions in this public fairs, but it was also behind several different policies that were trying to classify individuals based on the shape of their heads, classify them in terms of what they were able to do or not. Could they be trusted or not? Could they become leaders or not, etc. Right? So this is, once more, culture being validated, transformed into a biological reality, and then you have scientific methods replicating this biological reality by looking only at the things that separate these boxes rather than the things that unite these boxes, right? So once more, the biases we talked about at the beginning of this lecture, the cognitive biases that we discussed are directly associated with this tendency of us misrepresenting the data, the information we have about the world around us. Anthropometry, right, or the measurement of this of humans so that you can classify them and find their characteristics, was actually criticized also within the history of anthropology. And I think the most famous and the most influential anthropologist in that sense was actually Franz Boas, who actually measured the skulls, the crania of several, 18,000 immigrant families in the US that had parents born in Europe and children born in the US, right? And he was able to demonstrate that the children's heads actually differ to a mathematically definable degree. In other words, the place where you're born influences your biology more than your genetic inheritance. In other words, he was able to use this to demonstrate that racial markers aren't actually static in itself, that the typological concept of race by itself is not invalid. So he was one of the first anthropologists who were taking now scientific measurements, and instead of using the scientific measurements to find the differences between the so-called races, he was actually using this information to try to deconstruct the notion that races actually exist, to show that we change based on our environment. And this was tremendously influential, right? And it helped change the direction or the ways of how we actually look at modern human variation within the context of anthropology. But evidently he was not. He was one of the researchers looking at this from his own view, right? On the other side, you actually have several scientists who are focusing a lot on trying to define the attributes or create a scientific basis for racial discrimination, for racism. So Francis Galton here is like one of the most prominent examples of this, but there's a several line of researchers working on this, right? An English scientist who has this very clear Eurocentric view of the world, right? Like who shares this common fear already in the 1800s that civilized society was being weakened by the failure of natural selection to eliminate unfit and inferior individuals, right? So he was one of the people who actually pushed forward the movement of eugenics, this idea that we can do an improvement of the human race by trimming away modern human variation, by actually changing, defining who is able to reproduce and who's not able to reproduce, so that you can create a stronger human race. What was then later used by the Nazi movement to define the Uber race, right? This higher human race. This is based on this idea again that races exist, that races are static, that races are valid, and that the races are actually ranked inside the hierarchy. So this is something that was hugely popular in the early 1900s. It led to several of the eugenic movements that led to a series of the most atrocious genocides that happened in the history of our species, and sadly is still with us to a large degree, right? This has like implications not only in Europe in itself, right, but this has actually implications even here in the US. So the eugenics movement in America, this idea that we need to improve the genetic background of humans, create like a better human species, as if, again, evolution is something that grows from poorer to better, which is something that we know it's not the true. It's something that, like we talked before, right? It's all a response to the context. This is something that actually reflects itself also in American politics, right? Like in between the 1900s and 1930s, the US was the first country to actually legalize compulsory sterilization as part of this eugenic movement. As compulsory sterilization means that women would be sterilized without having their own consent, so that they could not reproduce, which would limit their chance of passing their genes forward, which would therefore, according to the eugenics argument, improve humankind in itself. As a result of this movement, we had over 20,000 forced sterilizations in California between 1909 and 1963, right? These forced sterilizations, again, these sterilizations that were made on women who never consented for the process, right? Like target mentally ill, target physically deformed woman, target blind, target Native Americans, right? Because Native Americans are perceived at this point as actually something that as a population, as a race, quote unquote race, that is inferior to the European descendant in itself. So after, it's only after the Second World War that this policy actually dies out, but not completely, right? Again, I'm going to highlight here that like these forced sterilizations were still happening in California up to 1963, right? Like almost 20 years after the Second World War was actually done. As we reach the 1950s, right, you see a reduced popularity of this type of eugenic discussions, right? However, it's not completely out of the curve. Like, again, one of the most nefarious ones that we can, examples of this is what happened with the work from Carlton Stevens Kuhn that identified 50 subspecies to humans, all of them ranked in a specific context, to the point that like the idea was that if you want to improve humankind, if you want to make humankind smarter in itself, you would even have to actually make sure that individuals that come from races that are not as smart would not reproduce as often, right? It repercutes in itself in arguments that lead all the way to the 1990s, right? Like, so for example, Richard Harnstein and Charles Murray actually defined that intelligence is both inherited and due to environmental factors, but then links intelligence to racial differences in intelligence itself, right? So you cannot really separate these two concepts together up to 1994. So we're talking about this again, the biases that we bring with us as a society are biases that we like, they're still affecting us in a long term. So these racial theories are used to largely justify the process of slavery, right? Like, so you can justify the slavery of African populations because they're seen as an inferior race. As an inferior race, they should not have the right to the same level of rights or the same role in shaping the future of humanity as other races. It justifies colonization, right? It justifies the killing of Native Americans. It justifies the restriction to immigrations, right? Like who is allowed or not to come to the country is defined a lot by a perception of the person's values. It justifies what we saw, what we just talked, the forced sterilization. It justifies ultimately genocide. We have several histories, several examples of genocide that are ultimately a result of racial discrimination, of racism, of this perception that human variation fits into boxes and that these boxes represent true categories of classification. So again, I want to highlight this idea that it was never truly a biological reality. This was transformed into a biological reality once this race was already created as a cultural category, because it is a categorization, it's a definition of humankind that also promotes and allows for the development of a specific type of political agenda, right? Of growth, of capitalistic growth, etc. Again, this discussion is very large. I really invite you all to talk to any of us to know more about this, or there are like other classes at OSU that will go much more in detail here. But the point being that if we don't understand the biases that affected and the creation of this, we can fall on the mistake, we can err on thinking that this is something that happens in the past, as these people were unaware of of what we know nowadays, and therefore they were mistaken. These people, to a large extent, right, like were as biased as we are in how we represent human variation. So we need to be much better as a human society in recognizing our biases so that we can remove this idea that there are biological realities when these biological realities were imposed on top of cultural differences. And you are all aware of the consequences of this, right? Like we all go through this, and the last years have been very intense in the discussions about the consequences of racial discrimination, right? So my contribution to the discussion, my provocation for you in this discussion is that this is not something that comes necessarily from people misunderstanding reality. This is something that comes from people trying to justify cultural definitions with biological characteristics that, when you really look into them, are not there to sustain this, right? And this is something that like characterizes most of the social development of in the US in itself. This is something that actually is still around with us, right? Like, so if nothing else, the last couple of years have shown us the rise of this type of thinking, right, where you can justify the classification of individuals, and once you define them, once you classify them, you find differences for them, right? Once you define that two things are different, it's easy for you to focus on the differences between them. If you really remove this difference and try to find the real validity for it, this is something that we actually cannot see in biology, but yet, because it is a cultural reality, because it's a culturally accepted concept, is something that it becomes then forced into a biological reality. And we don't even need to go that far, right? Like, this is not even something that is affecting only those individuals who are uneducated, those individuals who are not exposed to this discussion in itself, right? So in 2016, the day after the presidential election in 2016, we actually found around OSU in several of the in several different dorms and teaching halls, right? There were a lot of like white supremacist flyers being added to OSU. All of them coming from coming from students who are well educated, who are part of the elite in terms of the acquisition of knowledge of human society, and yet people who defend this idea of a different qualities or different values for different so-called races not because biology supports it, but because biology has been used to support things that have created, that have been given meaning by our cultural background, by the inheritance of a European colonial thinking itself. Again, this is one of the other examples that appear at OSU in itself, so you don't really need to go that far to find the cognition biases and to see the consequences that this cognition biases has on our classification of modern human diversity. So the main provocation here for us is to really understand the history behind this, because the history informs the biases that we're bringing with us, that all of us without exception carry, and how this affects our representation of reality, which in the case of classification of humans can have notoriously racist consequences. So anthropology has turned the page on that, right? From its beginnings as like focusing on the anthropometrics of measuring characteristics of humans to try to see if they can predict human behavior, human's ability, human's intelligence, etc., right? To a more a broader understanding of human variation, and how by integrating our understanding of evolutionary process, right? The idea of how evolution shapes biology, how cultures change, and also to adding all of our current understanding of the biases that we come, that are the result of this big historical processes, right? That result of a long history of colonial practices that made a lot of anthropology, a lot of scientists to come from a background of European descendants and have an impact on defining how we see modern variation, right? By combining all of this information, we get to a whole new understanding of race, which is the description of race that I presented to you in the previous lecture, right? That there is substantial variation among individuals within population, that there is some biological variation that is the result of differences between populations. However, most of the variation is actually the result of differences between individuals inside each population, right? And ultimately then that race is not an accurate or even productive way to describe human biological variation. So understand that like this is the culmination of us then incorporating in our worldview, in how we describe humanity, incorporating our learnings from evolution, our learnings from cultural diversity, our learnings from the history in itself, is at the interface of all of this that we find that this cultural creation of racial differences cannot be sustained. And therefore, I wanted to bring you into this lecture a little bit of this, right? Like both the evolution we saw before, the discussion we had about biological variation on the last lecture, and now a little bit of the history, to try to build up this multifaceted perspective on human variation. So, in other words, even though we now know that there is really no support for this idea of race, it's actually very important for us to also recognize that human variation, or the definition, the classification of humans inside the concept of race, has huge implications socially, biomedically, and forensically, right? Like we have implications all around of the all around of our own views of reality, right? Because of course differences exist between populations. It's just that these populations are not meaningful categories that can be easily distinguished as race. As I said before, you can find meaningful biological differences between Buckeyes and Michigan fans just because of the background of where they grew, how they grew, and what is the history of the cities and the cultures within which they grew. So in that sense, what I want to really like you guys take away from this lecture is that it is a fact that biological races don't exist, right? That we cannot classify humans in biological races, but that does not mean that they are not important, right? They actually have a huge importance, mostly because of the fact that there is the cultural construction of these ethnic groups as different races, and this has shaped a lot of the opportunities, a lot of the different ways through which individuals actually can navigate their lives and be or not successful in modern societies. So this is discussion is the result also resulted in the in a series of anthropologists writing about the ethics associated with race, etc. With race. I invite you all to take a look at this open letter about the ethics of characterizing differences, the guiding principles on using racial categories in human genetics, right, which informed a lot of the current discussions about the genetic differences that exist between the so-called races. If any of you is interested in reading this, let me know and I'll upload this as one of the resources for the class on Carmen. But basically, what this discussion entails, right, like what the ethics of characterizing difference entails, is summarized in these statements here, right, like where we believe that the statements that say that we believe that there is no scientific basis for any claim that a pattern of human genetic variation supports hierarchically organized categories of race and ethnicity. Emphasis here on hierarchically, right, which means that there's no evidence to support that one race or one population is superior to the other in any way. The authors urge those who use genetic information to reconstruct an individual's geographic ancestry to present results within the broader context of an individual's overall ancestry rather than just classifying them in specific races. And they recognize that racial and ethnic categories are created and maintained within social political contexts, right? Once more, the social context has defined the definition of classifications, and biology came after it. Biology was never at the start of this discussion. And that context have shifted in meaning over time, meaning that what was true a few centuries ago is not a true way to represent societies anymore. That needs to be taken into account when we discuss modern human variation. And the consequences of this are huge. Again, we're living years where this has become more and more explicit. But again, just to highlight, to emphasize the point, right? Like depending on your racial classification in the US, you have several different your expectations, your possibilities, your opportunities in as an individual are vastly different, right? Starting from the fact that unemployment is much larger among those individuals classified as black than those individuals classified as white, that the growing the wealth divide, the gap between the wealth among white and other races in the US has and continues to increase over time, right? Like it's something that increased considerably from the 1980s to 2013, and it's expected to really peak in the next couple decades. That there are different experiences and different susceptibilities, right? Where like, again, Black Lives Matters is right there at the forefront of our discussions of social justice at this point, right? It arose in response to several incidents in the US in which Black lives did not seem to matter to police or other local officials, right? It's been repeated over and over again. It's been happening over and over again. And it is the consequence of us seeing different expectations, like 1 in every 3 black men in the US will be in jail at some point in their lives, compared to only 1 in every 70 white men, right? Like, so all of this structural discrimination has shaped how we perceive modern human variation. And this is something that is the result of social constructs and social policies that have been based themselves on biological information. However, once more, this biological information was superimposed on categories that already were there, that already existed. So you see the impact that history has, right? Like in this structuring of discrimination, in the structure of the differential opportunities individuals have, coming from actually a long time ago, from centuries of development that has once more superimposed biological differences on categories that are only meaningful from a cultural perspective, that were only meaningful from a cultural perspective a few centuries ago. So take a look, for example, what's happening in Columbus with the redlining, right? Redlining is a common practice in several cities of the US, where like banks and other developers actually define which districts are actually worth investing in, which are not, so that they create these really red lines around it and say like everyone who's inside the red lined district is of higher risk of not paying loans, is of lower socioeconomical status, is a more violent neighborhood, etc., 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 which means that our neighborhoods have received less investment overall. So now compare this original redlining from Columbus from 1930, right? And take a look at how this correlates with a current distribution of the families in each of these districts in terms of black and white families. So in this map that I'm showing here on the right, the purple districts are the districts that have the highest proportion of white families. The clearer, the less dark purple colors are the districts that have more percentage of black families living inside. And if you look at it, right, you actually compare these two, and you're gonna see a perfect overlap, right? Like all of the red lined districts from almost a century ago, from 90 years ago, are now black neighborhoods in Columbus, not because the black communities are less able to actually develop and to create the better conditions of living itself, right? But because they were forced into this neighborhood because there are the less affluent districts of Columbus in itself, right? So the consequences, the inertia of the social movements also explains a lot of the inequalities that we see today. So once more, the provocation that I want to bring here to you guys is that, yeah, we need to understand all of this inertia. We need to understand all of the historical impact that has in defining a lot of our perceptions. If nowadays there is a correlation between socioeconomic status or even education level between populations that come from different backgrounds, this is not rooted in biology. This is rooted in the fact that historically individuals that are part from the minorities have been offered less opportunities to grow, to develop, and to become important players in the development of our societies. This is true locally, right? This is true globally as well. Like there's a lot of genocide and politicized deaths around the world that are the result of anti-ethnic discrimination that is rooted on the idea that we have biological characteristics between ethnic groups that makes one group better than the other, right? So genocides, defined as the deliberate elimination of a group through mass murder, and ethnocide, defined as the destruction of an ethnic group cultures, are the result of racial discrimination, most of the times because they are associated with a superimposition of biological meaning on top of cultural relevant categories. Not the other way around. It's not like we have a biological differences then later becomes of cultural meaning. We have the creation, the context where culture becomes an important distinctive factor between individuals, and then individuals start to find those traits, those characteristics, those biological aspects that differentiate them to validate this discrimination itself. This will cause a series of problems, not only in terms of like the extermination of groups, right, but also it will cause the forced assimilation of several ethnic groups. It will cause the expulsion of some ethnic groups, like pushing them to leave their original countries in itself. You see, right, like this actually responded or resulting in a very large movement of populations, right, where you create like this anti-ethnic discrimination will create several refugees across of the planet. And you can see in this map some of these like regions of where most refugees have been coming from, who are people who are actually chosen or were forced to actually flee the country to escape persecution of war. So, folks, I know this is like a hard social concept. I know this is probably not what you were expecting when you enrolled on a class that will ultimately talk about human evolution, but I do think that this is one of the important lessons that we can take out of this, right? What we learn in this class, what we learn over the semester that relates to the origin of humanity, to how we came to be, is also directly associated with how we understand humanity in itself. And if we understand humanity in ourselves as groups that cannot be divided in race, this is a concept that still has been hard to share with everyone. It's hard to become like common knowledge, or even like well accepted in among the most developed countries in the planet, like an example of the US, mostly because we come from a long history of thinking humanity as like a series of boxes that do not overlap with each other. So what I want you to do as a provocation, as a challenge, is really to locate the biases that we talk, the cognitive bias that we talk about, that affects how we all represent reality, and for you to locate as well what are the limits of the boxes that we believe, and then look for these boxes. Try to figure out, are these limits really true? Are these limits really biological, or are we imposing biological meaning on top of things that are not originally part of our biology? It's a huge exercise. It's a huge endeavor. And the more people that do this exercise, I think the better it will be, the easier it will be for us to have a discussion on how to counteract social discrimination, social injustice, racial discrimination, and racism across the planet. So, as I mentioned, this is a topic that can be covered in several semesters actually, and indeed we offer other classes that talk about this in more details in the department and other departments at OSU. So if you want to know more about this, if you want to know more readings about it, if you want suggestions of documentaries to watch that discuss these topics in more details, let me know. I'll be more than happy to share more resources with you. And as always, if you have any questions, any concerns, or any comments, reach out to us and we'll be more than willing to talk to you. In the meantime, I hope you guys all stay safe, stay well, and I'll see you all in our next lecture next week.